very famous poet, Alexander Pope, remarked that the proper study of mankind is man. Perhaps no one has taken that comment more seriously than Sigmund Freud. Freud spent more than 50 years studying human behavior and human nature. Today's program is the first of a series I'm doing on Sigmund Freud, the controversial and famous Sigmund Freud. And the series is entitled Freuds Lessons. The programs will focus on Freud's ideas concerning the following: happiness and unhappiness. What did Freud have to say about happiness and unhappiness? Human nature, religion, education, women, human relationships, the possibility of using drugs to treat mental disorders. That's right, early in the 20th century, Freud was thinking about the possibility of someday people using drugs to treat mental illness. And finally, I'll be talking about Freud's legacy. What are some of the possible lessons we can learn from his life's work? In explaining Freud's ideas, I will often give you his own words. And also, I'll be recommending books by Freud and about Freud. First, a brief overview of Freud's life. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in what is now the Czech Republic. He was born 4 years before Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. Freud died in 1939 at the age of 83. At that time, Franklin D. Roosevelt was the President of the United States. So Freud's life spanned approximately the time from Abraham Lincoln to the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt. When Freud was 4 years of age, his family moved to Vienna, Austria, and Freud lived almost his entire life in Vienna. At age 25, Freud earned a medical degree from the University of Vienna. And at age 30, he married. He married Martha Bernays, an Orthodox Jew. And the two of them produced 6 children, although Freud was insistent on raising his children as secular Jews. More about that in a later program. Freud began his professional life as a medical doctor with a specialty in neurology. He later became famous as the founder of psychoanalysis. And what is psychoanalysis? Well, let me give you Freud's own definition. According to Freud, in his autobiography, he says that psychoanalysis is, quote, the science of unconscious mental processes. The science of unconscious mental processes. Freud wrote many books. In fact, Professor Harold Bloom, in his book on the Western canon, a book in which he talks about which writers he considers to be the great writers in the Western tradition, and which books he considers to be the great books, says that Freud was one of the great essayists of all time. Essayists. And I think the reason Professor Bloom puts Freud in that category is that while Freud wrote many books, most of them are pretty short, and therefore he categorizes them as essays. Among Freud's best-known books are The Interpretation of Dreams. It was that book that made him famous. And also Civilization and Its Discontents, a book he wrote late in life, which provides a very good overview of his work. Professor Bloom sees many similarities between Shakespeare's version of human behavior and human nature and Freud's. And indeed, Professor Bloom points out that Freud's favorite writer was Shakespeare, that indeed Freud read Shakespeare in English. Freud's native language, of course, was German, but he did learn English and did read Shakespeare in English. In fact, Professor Bloom says that Freud perhaps was never willing to admit that so many of the ideas that he expressed about human behavior, Shakespeare had expressed several centuries before. And now for Freud's ideas on a variety of themes. Let's start with happiness. First, the bad news, because Freud does have some bad news concerning our prospects for being happy, but he also has some good news. The bad news is this: Freud was not optimistic about our possibilities for becoming very happy. Indeed, Freud said that happiness is only possible for us as an episodic phenomenon. Let me give you his own words. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. Happiness is possible only as an episodic phenomenon. We are so made that we can derive intense pleasure only from a contrast. We can derive intense pleasure only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. Freud then goes on to give an example. If we experience 10 sunny days in a row, we'll probably be happiest during the first 2 or 3 sunny days. But around the 10th sunny day in a row, our happiness will not be as great because, as he says, we are so constituted that generally we experience happiness through a contrast rather than a state of things. Freud concludes with this sentence: "Thus our possibilities of happiness are already restricted by our constitution." With regard to unhappiness, and I'll have more, by the way, to say about happiness and what he believed we can do to become happier. A little later I'll address myself to that. But right now, let me talk about what Freud considered to be the 3 main causes of unhappiness in life. The 3 major causes of unhappiness in life. First, Freud claimed, decay and dissolution of one's body as we grow older is a major cause of unhappiness. The second major cause of unhappiness he cites is natural disasters, things like earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis. And the third major cause of unhappiness in life, according to Freud, is other people. And Freud said we should not underestimate the amount of unhappiness that other people cause us in life. Freud, in this sense, sounds a little like the novelist, philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who became famous for many reasons, but perhaps one of the most provocative things he ever wrote was the following. Jean-Paul Sartre said this, and I'm quoting him: "Hell is other people. Hell is other people." And now for the good news from Freud concerning happiness. Freud did believe that while our prospects for becoming very happy were not good, that we could become happier. And Freud claimed that we can think ourselves into becoming less anxious and more tranquil. That's right, we can think ourselves into becoming less anxious and more tranquil. He believed in the idea of problem solving through thinking more clearly. And what does this involve? Well, among the things it involves are increasing our self-awareness. The ancient Greek maxim, "Know thyself," Freud found very relevant, and Freud believed if we wanted to increase our happiness in life, it was very important that we come to a better understanding of ourselves, and indeed increase our awareness of ourselves. Also, another path to greater tranquility would be gaining greater control over our instincts, especially our instincts for sex and aggression. Freud claimed that if we do not succeed in gaining some significant control over these instincts for sex and aggression, that we would suffer because of that. Freud also believed that if we wanted to be more tranquil, it was very important that we all engage in sublimation. And what is sublimation? Well, according to Freud, sublimation involves channeling a lot of our sexual energy into other areas of our life, our work, our families, for example, hobbies. Freud, as liberal as he was on sex, did not believe that we should use all of our sexual energy to have sex, but rather, as I said, to channel some of that energy into other avenues of life. Finally, Freud, when talking about the criteria of mental health, the standards he used to judge mental health, Freud said this: if a person can love and work, those are 2 pretty good indications that the person is in reasonably good mental health. Freud realized that many people work jobs they very much dislike, but Freud said there is still some hope for them, that they could find some kind of meaningful activity outside of work to make their lives better and to make themselves more tranquil. Freud believed the main thing was finding something to engage the mind, something to concentrate on. Psychiatrists call it the state of flow, that when we are in the state of flow, we forget about time, we forget about our problems, because again, the mind is engaged, we are concentrating. And Freud believed that if we all wish to become more tranquil, more joyful, and less anxious, it's very important that we find something in life that we can concentrate on. This reminds me of a comment made by Professor Joseph Campbell, very famous professor of mythology at Sarah Lawrence College. Campbell, on the subject of happiness and unhappiness, said this: "Find a place of joy, and the joy will burn out the pain." Find a place of joy, and the joy will burn out the pain. Freud was a social critic. Freud believed that society generally corrupts people, and that the reason society generally corrupts people is that society, like people, is in many ways irrational. Freud therefore believed that greater happiness involves freeing oneself from the harmful influences of society. Again, greater happiness involves freeing oneself from the harmful influences of society. And what might be some significant examples of the irrationality of society? Well, we know at various times Jewish people were treated horribly. In fact, we know this resulted in the Holocaust, in which more than 6 million Jews perished. Freud, himself a Jew, would say discrimination against Jews, again, is an example of irrational behavior on the part of human beings. Another outstanding example that Freud gave, discrimination of black people over the centuries. Again, discriminating against people only because of the color of their skin. And Freud concluded how irrational that is, how crazy in a certain sense that is, to discriminate against someone on the basis of the color of their skin. And of course, we know that women over the centuries, and even today, are often treated horribly in many societies. That in so many societies over the centuries, women were treated as being inferior to men. And again, so many experts on society, sociologists and psychiatrists, psychologists, would say the treatment of women over the centuries is another example of the irrationality in human beings. What have other thinkers said about this idea that society is often, if not usually, irrational, and that it's very important for us to free ourselves from its harmful effects? Well, the very famous German philosopher Nietzsche said this, and I'm quoting him: "Insanity in individuals is rare, but in groups and nations it is the rule." Insanity in individuals is rare, but in groups and nations it is the rule. Remember, Nietzsche was a German. He died in 1900. It's almost as if he was prescient and in a certain sense predicted the Holocaust. Nietzsche, by the way, was not a Jew, but very much resented Germans who were anti-Semitic. Let me move to another aspect of Freud's view of people and life. And this again is related to some of the things I've already talked about. I wish to address myself to Freud's view of human nature. Freud's view of human nature. Freud, as you have probably concluded already, had a rather low opinion of human nature. He said that men are not gentle creatures. Freud believed that people are innately aggressive, that we are born aggressive. When we come out of the womb, we are aggressive. And indeed, one of the most famous statements Freud ever made, and he made it in Latin, he said, "Homo homini lupus," which translated means, man is a wolf to man. Let me give you, before I give you more of Freud's own words on human nature, you might want to know, what was Freud's evidence for declaring that human beings are not gentle creatures and are aggressive by nature? Well, among the evidence Freud cites in his books is history. Freud says that anyone who is a student of history, after reading about all the invasions, conquests, wars, religious persecutions, genocide in history, has to conclude that man is a very aggressive creature. Again, here are his own words on human nature. And these words are from a classic book he wrote late in life, a book I highly recommend to you. It's not difficult reading, and again provides a terrific overview of his beliefs. The name of the book is Civilization and Its Discontents. And here's what Freud says about human nature, and I'm quoting him. Men are not gentle creatures. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man, who, in the face of all his experience of life and of history, will have the courage to dispute this assertion. Man is a savage beast to whom consideration of his own kind is something alien. Again, it's important to point out that Freud was a Jew, and while he died before the Holocaust, he died in 1939, he, of course, was well aware of all the discrimination Jews had suffered in history, and indeed his own family had suffered discrimination. So perhaps the fact that he was in a minority group that was so much persecuted over the centuries helped influence his view of human nature. Freud claimed that the greatest hindrance to civilization is the following, and again I'm quoting him: the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. Again, the greatest hindrance to civilization, the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. Freud's view of history, by the way, very much reminds me of that of a very famous historian. His name is Edward Gibbon, very famous 18th century British historian, who said this about history. And again, he sounds very Freudian, or maybe I should say Freud sounds very much like Professor Gibbon. Professor Gibbon said this. He said that history is little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of humankind. History is little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of humankind. What have other thinkers said about human nature? Well, philosophers such as Aristotle and Thomas Hobbes more or less are in agreement with Freud, or I should say were more or less in agreement with Freud. And I've already mentioned the very famous French intellectual and philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said that hell is other people. By the way, it's interesting that despite Sartre's gloomy view of people, when he died, 50,000 Frenchmen showed up at his funeral in Paris. There have, of course, been some more optimistic thinkers on the subject of human nature. And let me cite some of them. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very famous French thinker, he said, and I'm quoting him, "Man is naturally good. Man is naturally good, loving justice and order." That Rousseau did not believe that we are innately aggressive. Rousseau claimed that if we are aggressive, it's because society has corrupted us. But we are not aggressive when we come out of the womb, as Freud believed. The famous Chinese thinkers, Confucius and Mencius, both would have disagreed with Freud in terms of the very famous controversy whether it's nature or nurture primarily that forms us. These Chinese thinkers believed it was mostly nurture. Confucius and Mencius believed that people basically are formed by society. People are basically formed by society. So that in a certain sense we can modify human nature by improving society. And finally, the Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama, has said about human nature that he believes that human beings are at bottom good, that human beings are, at bottom, good. What do you think? For the benefit of those who tuned in late, you're watching Life, Love, and Philosophy, and this segment is devoted to Sigmund Freud, and it's entitled Freud's Lessons. According to Freud, since he had such a gloomy view of human nature, what did he believe could be done to get people to behave more decently? Well, Freud did not look to religion to get people to behave more decently. As you probably know, Freud was an atheist, and I'll have more to say about that either later in this program or my next program. No, Freud believed if one wanted to get human beings to behave better, it was very important that society do something to change the relationship of human beings to possessions. Freud believed that in one way or another, our competition for things, for stuff, contributes to our aggressiveness. Again, our competition for things, for stuff, contributes to our aggressiveness. And if we had a different attitude towards possessions, perhaps we would all treat each other better. You might be wondering, was Freud a communist? No, he was not a communist. He believed that the communist system would not solve the problem of getting people to behave better. Let me give you his own words on communism. Freud said this: I cannot inquire into whether the abolition of private property is expedient or advantageous, but I am able to recognize that the psychological premises on which the communist system is based are an illusion. He goes on to say, aggressiveness was not created by private property. Aggressiveness was not created by private property. What have other thinkers said about getting people to improve the way they treat other people? Well, Confucius, the utilitarians who whose thoughts really developed into European socialism, and many liberals, they have claimed that if you want to get people to behave better towards each other, you need paternalistic government. Some would say big government. I think they would choose the expression paternalistic government. And what does that mean? Well, it means a governments that go a long way in satisfying people's physical needs, material needs. That Confucius and Jeremy Bentham, very famous European philosophy, and so many liberal philosophers have said, if you want to get people to behave better towards each other, the government must attempt to ensure that their needs are met, their needs for food, shelter, healthcare, etc. Of course, religious thinkers would very much disagree with Sigmund Freud. So many religious thinkers over the centuries have said if you want to get people to behave better towards each other, put the fear of God in them. Put the fear of God in people. Put the fear of going to hell in people. And that's how you'll get people to behave better towards one another. In this context, I've often quoted Voltaire, very famous 18th century intellectual who said this about God and religion. Voltaire said, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And Voltaire went on to say that he wanted his lawyer and his baker and his tailor to all believe in God, because if they did, they were less likely to rip him off. Let me address myself to Freud's views on religion, and I only have a couple of minutes to do this, so I'll provide a summary of his beliefs on religion, and in the next program on Freud I'll have more to say about this. I mentioned that Freud was an atheist. He was raised in a secular Jewish family. He married, oddly enough, an Orthodox Jew, Martha Bernays, but he insisted that they raise their 6 children as secular Jews. So his children did not go to synagogue. In fact, Martin, one of his children, after Freud's death, said that he had never been in a synagogue until he was in his 20s. Freud believed that all religions are mass delusions. Those are his words. All religions are mass delusions. Freud goes on to say that religions substitute wishful fantasies for reality. Religions substitute wishful fantasies for reality. And what is one of these wishful fantasies? Well, according to Freud, he believed that so many people look upon God as an exalted father figure who looks after us. Again, Freud said that's a fantasy, the idea that God is an exalted father figure who looks after us. Let me give you his own words, which I think summarize pretty well his view of religion. Freud said this: "Religion is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that it is painful to think that the majority of people will never be able to rise above this view of life." Freud believed that science and art, not religion, promote human understanding. Again, Freud believed that science and art, not religion, promote human understanding. In fact, Freud, in this context, quotes the very famous German thinker Goethe. Goethe said this: "He who possesses science and art also has religion, but he who possesses neither of these, let him have religion." I must point out, by the way, that many famous thinkers, including philosophers and scientists, have expressed a belief in God, so would have disagreed with Freud in this sense. Among the famous philosophers who are devoutly religious were the French philosophers Blaise Pascal and Descartes, usually considered to be the founder of modern philosophy. And also, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant expressed a belief in God. And again, I must mention that when surveys are taken of American scientists, surveys show that a significant percentage of American scientists believe in God. I have not seen the latest surveys, but I recall one I saw years ago indicating that about 40% of American scientists express a belief in God. Next week, I'll have much more to say about Freud, and I'll address myself, to Freud's views on women and human relationships. It's a good thing the program is ending. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau wrote the following: "The highest of arts is to affect the quality of the day."